Good evening, everyone. We're really thrilled to have Dr. John Mason with us this evening. He's an associate professor of history at the University of Virginia, where he teaches, he's an associate professor of history. There he teaches African history as well as the history of photography. Please help me welcome tonight's featured speaker, Dr. John Mason.
Well, it's really great to be here. It's my second time speaking on this stage. And as Valerie said, I've been involved in a couple of other projects here at the VMFA, so it's starting to feel like home, it really is. I want to thank Valerie for that gracious introduction, but also for asking me to give this talk tonight. Coming here to the VMFA is always seamless and fun. Katie, thank you very much for making all the arrangements, and I'm staying in the world's best B&B, and I want to thank Melinda over at the Museum District B&B for making the stay just so pleasant. Okay, so I actually want to show you some portraits without talking about them. Then I'll come back and talk about them. So one of the first things I did after I checked into the B&B yesterday was that I came over here to see the Sir Isaac Julien exhibition, Lessons of the Moment. And as I'm sure most of you know, it's this powerful, immersive, multi-screen, multimedia meditation on Frederick Douglass. And it's immensely moving, but like a lot of great art, it's also exhilarating. You know, I came out of it both emotionally spent, but also, as I said, exhilarated and energized by the power of that piece. It manages in a half hour to capture the essence of an immensely complicated human being, Frederick Douglass. And one of the things that it does is it highlights Frederick Douglass's thinking about photography. Douglass was immensely prescient when it came to thinking about photography. He was one of the first great photo theorists anywhere in the world. He's doing this no more than 20 years after photography has been invented. You know, photography was this astonishing new thing, this new technology. It fascinated people in the same way that we're fascinated by the internet or by the cell phone, because we understand how it has the potential to change the world, or to bring it up to the present day, the way that we're talking about artificial intelligence and the way that it has potential to change everything that we do. Well, photography was so new and so wonderful because it could make pictures easily. You know, before that, if you wanted to have a picture made, it had to be somebody who knew how to draw and somebody who knew how to paint, and somebody with some skill, or otherwise it wasn't going to be a very good picture. And here was this new technology that could make pictures very well and could make them very cheaply, and it did change the world. And Douglass understood its potential for African Americans as well. As you know, he was born about 1817 on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was born enslaved and spent his life enslaved until he was about 20 years old when he managed to escape. You know, he lived in a period where the visual representation of African Americans, the way that African Americans were depicted and pictured, were the most demeaning and cruel racial stereotypes you can possibly imagine. And he saw in photography the potential for African Americans to seize the means of reproduction. Now, that doesn't mean making the pictures themselves with their own cameras. Douglass himself was probably the most photographed man of the 19th century. This is true. He really loved photography and understood its power. He was photographed over and over and over again. He did not photograph himself, though. He relied on a professional to do it. And he understood that, you know, photography has the potential to change the way that African Americans are seen. And he meant the way they're seen in two senses. You know, the literal sense of what African Americans really look like. We don't look like those stereotypes and cliches. But to see also means to understand. And if you change the way that we're seen, maybe you'll change the way that we're understood. Well, the people that I just showed you in that very brief slideshow, you know, they did not write photo theory. They were not articulate in the way that Frederick Douglass was, one of the great intellectuals who's ever lived. But they understood what photography could do. Photography could show the world, could show them to the world as they wished to be seen, as they saw themselves. You know, each one of these photographs was made at a very dark time in American history, and yet you don't see it. So, you know, here's Lula Cosby. Yeah, she probably made every stitch of clothing that she's wearing except for maybe the hat. She was a seamstress. That's what she did for a living. She was a seamstress. But in this photograph and in her pose, she's showing you that she's something very, very different from that. Cora Ross, did I get the, yeah, sorry. I sometimes get the name wrong. Cora Ross, I mean, she's showing you how she wants to be seen. She's a woman of tremendous strength. She's a woman of tremendous intelligence. She's also a woman of style, a woman of fashion. The way that she's holding herself, she's a woman of grace. You know, all of these things are things that were denied to African American women in the visual culture in the early 20th century. But you would never look at her and think, wow, I mean, this is a woman who spent the early part of her working life as a housekeeper for affluent white families, that she later moved onto a farm, that she and her family ran, her husband and her children, they together ran a farm while she took in washing. And after they left the farm in old age, she continued to take in washing. You know, the Biggers family here, you would look at William Biggers, you would never think that he was a jack of all trades. Well, that's what he was. At least that's how he earned a living. But, you know, I said that exactly wrong. That's not what he was. That is how he earned a living. But the Biggers here are showing you who they are. William Biggers worked as a jack of all trades in the Charlottesville region, but the entire family eventually moves to Columbus, Ohio in search of opportunity, and they find it there. William Biggers opens up his own house painting business, and we can trace him as far as 1950, where he's a homeowner. The girls are out of the house and grown and married, a couple of them, and his wife no longer has to work outside of the house. Linwood Stepp. You look at Linwood Stepp. Well, what was he? He was a farm boy. His father was a blacksmith and a small farmer in Albemarle County outside of Charlottesville. He probably had this picture made for his family in order for them to remember him. He was leaving, like so many of the young people in our portraits that we have in our exhibition. They were part of the Great Migration. They left the South, or at least they left the rural South, going to cities like Richmond, Washington, D.C., going to the north, Philadelphia, New York, Boston. If you went the other way, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit. They were looking for opportunity that just simply was not available in Albemarle County. And Linwood Stepp found it. He went to Buffalo. Soon after arriving in Buffalo, he was drafted into the Army. He was one of about 300,000 African Americans who served during World War I. He was one of 200,000 who served overseas. He was promoted to sergeant, which was unusual at the time for African Americans to achieve that rank. Went back to Buffalo and found his piece of the American dream, you know, the family, the house, etc. A.J. Buckner was born into slavery. He was born into slavery and really made something of himself. He attended Hampton University. He became a grocer in Charlottesville. His son, George W. Buckner, became a significant civil rights leader, and I'm going to talk about George W. Buckner in a few minutes. And that's George's daughter, Eileen, that you have there. But this picture, you know, it's a layered picture, but it's a picture that, reminds you of the title of Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up from Slavery. Another layered picture. The man is Dr. George Ferguson. He was one of the first African-American physicians to practice permanently in the Charlottesville area. He was also very active in politics. And you're thinking, wow, African-Americans were active in politics at the time? I thought there was a poll tax. Yes, there was. And you had to pay it 3 years in a row. And if you didn't pay it 3 years in a row, you couldn't vote. And if you missed a year, you had to start over. But African Americans did get involved in politics, and George Sr. was a leader in the Republican Party back when the Republican Party was still the party of Lincoln, and most African Americans were affiliated with it. He attended national conventions of the Republican Party. The little boy, George Jr., grows up to be in the 1950s one of the most important civil rights leaders in Charlottesville. He's the head of the local branch of the NAACP. When it has to sue the city of Charlottesville to desegregate the schools. Charlottesville was part of the massive resistance to the Brown versus Board of Education decision and had to be sued to desegregate the schools. Louise, the daughter, is part of the Great Migration. She goes to Cleveland where she becomes a librarian in the public library system and marries and has a family as well. Zenobia Elias, she's wearing her graduation gown. It is very common for both white and African American young women when they graduated to come have their portrait made in their white gown. Zenobia is probably wearing a gown that her mother made. Her mother was a seamstress, and her mother would have had the skills to make a beautiful gown like this. Zenobia's mother is interesting for another reason. Immediately after the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920, the 19th Amendment was the amendment that gave women the right to vote in federal elections. Zenobia's mother went downtown, paid her poll tax, and registered to vote immediately afterwards. And she was one of over 100 African American women in Charlottesville who registered to vote immediately after the passage of the 19th Amendment. Before we started this project, this kind of history was unknown. And I love showing Reuben Gordon's portrait to public groups and to my students and people like that. And people always want to guess what he did, and they said, oh, he's a banker. I said, no, in Charlottesville in no. Oh, he must be a lawyer, he's a teacher, he's a principal, he's this, that, and the other. And, he was a man of great responsibility. There is no question about that. And he understood how to project the idea that he is a man of great responsibility. But here's a portrait of him at work. Or it's actually a portrait of the horse. So he worked for a guy called Ortner. who had made piles of money on Wall Street and bought a very large horse farm in western Albemarle County, and you can get a sense of how large this horse farm was. Reuben Gordon was the stable manager and had a number of employees underneath him. And so he was a man of considerable responsibility. But one of the things about these portraits is that you cannot guess what a person's occupation is from the portraits. These portraits are about character and about what's inside the person far more than they are about this person's place in society. So, my colleague up at University of Virginia is one of many people who has followed Frederick Douglass in thinking about the meaning of photographs, and especially to African Americans, and he's thinking about portraits in precisely this period and what it might mean. Those portraits, the ones we've seen so far, are about projecting a kind of middle-class respectability. And that middle-class respectability is an assertion to equality, right? It is saying to white Americans, you misunderstand us, you don't know us, see us through our own eyes, see us that we are equal to you, and if we are equal to you, our rights should be equal to your rights. Now, it was a plea that fell on deaf ears, but this is one of the meanings behind the photographs. Of course, it's not the only meaning. I was just talking about Linwood Stepp, who had his portrait made as a token to his family to remember him by. I'm going to skip Bill Hurley and come back to him in just a second. So we do have this large exhibition at the University of Virginia, and it's on view until June the 23rd. Please come up and see it. You can't do it by yourself. We've had a really big team. One of the most exciting things is that we've had a bunch of undergraduates helping us with this, doing a lot of the research. And we're standing on the shoulders of people who pioneered working with these Holsinger studio portraits of African Americans. About 20 years ago, Reginald Butler, I'm sad to say, the late Reginald Butler and Scott French put on a small exhibition that really showed what could be done with these portraits. The man who made the portraits is sitting in the passenger seat of this 1903 Ford. His name was Rufus Holsinger, and let me stop and correct myself. The man who owned the studio that made these portraits is sitting in the passenger seat of that 1903 Ford. Rufus Holsinger was indeed a photographer, and when he was getting started in his photographic studio, he certainly made all or the majority of the photographs. But by the time the photographs I'm showing you were made, it was a very successful studio, by far and away the largest in the city. And he employed a number of photographers, retouch artists, darkroom technicians, sales clerks, bookkeepers. About 25 people in all worked for the studio. Now, you're wondering, well, this looks like a white guy. And Rufus Holsinger absolutely was a white guy. And there's no evidence that he was a racial liberal in any sense of the word. In fact, there's some evidence that he was not a racial liberal. He sponsored legislation that would have segregated Charlottesville by race. Charlottesville was informally segregated, but this would have enshrined segregation in law. He sponsored legislation when he served on city council in order to do that. It never actually happened. So you're saying, well, how could a studio owned by a guy like this make such beautiful portraits of African Americans? And you might ask the same thing of J.P. Ball, an African American photographer who had studios in Cincinnati and then eventually in Helena, Montana. Very successful and quite famous now photographer, and he photographed white people. And the answer is that, well, there's black and there's white, but there is also green. And, and so these photographers understood that, if we make a portrait that pleases the customer is going to go home and they're going to say to their friends and to their family, you can trust the Holsinger studio. They'll treat you right and they'll make a beautiful portrait. And that's really important for us to understand because, in our exhibition, we are arguing that these images show African Americans the way they wish to be seen, and they say something about them that they wish to say. And that could only happen if you have the positive collaboration of the photographer, and I think in all of these images that we absolutely did. There was one African American employee at the studios, Horace Porter, started working for the studio in about 1912 when he was still in his late teens, stayed with the studio until into the 1960s. He started out as a janitor and as a sort of delivery driver. He eventually becomes the darkroom technician. So his life absolutely does progress to greater responsibilities and greater skills. In the same collection, there just happens to be a picture of Viola Green. Did I get her name right? Yes. Just happens to be a picture of Viola Green. She and Horace married 6 months after this portrait was made. And I was saying that it was very common for young women to have their graduation portraits made. It's her 8th grade graduation. There was no high school. There was no high school for African American children in Charlottesville. That was a big point of contention in the black community. Viola was much older than 8th graders are today, so don't worry about that. In any case, Horace and Viola they were married for nearly 70 years. Nearly 70 years, had 8 children, nearly 70 years. It's a beautiful marriage. And there's still, as you would guess, lots of descendants in town. So, these images are happening during the Jim Crow era, and as I was saying, it's an era with these really awful depictions of African Americans. That phrase, Jim Crow, does come from the Jim Crow character of blackface minstrelsy, happy-go-lucky, stupid, ragged African American. And I don't have to spend very much time on these images because you're familiar with the Mammy. You're familiar with the Black Thug. Yeah, those images I was showing you at first were national images, but of course they appear in the local white newspaper in Charlottesville, the Daily Progress. So, you'd see cartoons like this of a foolish African American, the African American dandy. I mean, these were part of the visual culture of the time, and of course African Americans knew that. And they also knew that these kinds of demeaning cliches and stereotypes are all about saying something about who black people were and where black people fit in the hierarchy of races. And so the so-called scientific, I need to wiggle my fingers here, the pseudo-scientific version of those cartoons I was just showing you were illustrations like this, which purport to show that people of African descent are placed somewhere between, in the racial hierarchy, between whites at the very, very top, but members of the ape family below. These images, I'm going to hurry a little bit here, are made at a really ugly period in Charlottesville's history. And Charlottesville spent a lot of time thinking about its history over the last few years. And you know about our struggles with the Confederate memorials similar to Richmond's. We've learned a lot about segregation. We've learned about the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Here the Ku Klux Klan is being formed at a moonlight ceremony at Thomas Jefferson's grave at Monticello. The UVA had a Ku Klux Klan chapter. This is an illustration from the yearbook. The Klan was ordinary, it was like what's a fraternal organization? It's like the JCs, I guess, like the Chamber of Commerce. It was just so common, so ordinary. So it was a time when we were erecting our statues. And Thomas Jefferson played a role in shaping, what we think of as the way that African Americans were understood at the time. He was of course we honor him as the apostle of liberty. And those words, what are they? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, those words have inspired people all over the world, all over the world. And Martin Luther King couldn't use them enough because he understood that that promise had never been fulfilled. And one of the reasons that promise had never been fulfilled because Thomas Jefferson was also one of the godfathers of scientific racism. You can read this quote for yourself. UVA has a history of that. This is Dr. Paul Barringer. Paul Barringer was a medical doctor. He's credited with really reforming medical education at the University of Virginia. He's also president of the university for a time. He wrote a book called The American Negro. I'll give you a sense of what the American Negro said. Yeah. One of my predecessors on the faculty at the University of Virginia. That's something to deal with, I tell you. So if you think of people as savages, well, you can lynch them, right? The Richmond Planet was the African-American newspaper here in Richmond, and it has a lot of information about Charlottesville. We've used it extensively. But if you think of people as these cartoonish, awful characters, and if you think of them as savages, then that's what you do. And yet, the reality that Frederick Douglass understood, just like Joe and Peggy Spears understood, that there is a power in photography to say no. There's a power in photography to say that those caricatures are a lie. There's a power in photography to say that that understanding that's created by people like Barringer and Jefferson, that is also a lie. Now, both Joe and Peggy Spears were born into slavery. Spent first couple of decades of their lives enslaved. But, you know, that did not define them. Jim Crow did not define them. When they had this portrait made, they were the patriarch and matriarch of a large extended family with children and grandchildren and some great-grandchildren. They were successful farmers. If you've ever driven past Charlottesville on I-64, part of the way you were driving over where their farm used to be. Right, Percy Payne and Josephine Bowles. I know most of the names. You know, their lives were also a refutation of these notions of who African Americans are. And, you know, it's a very beautiful portrait of a couple who are soon to get married. They grew up in the same part of Albemarle County. They both grew up on farms. They had trouble getting on their feet, as you would expect. A young African-American couple without family money, and you know, the education that was available to African-American children was not very good at all. But they finally find their place after Percy does serve in World War I, and he does go to France. But after he returns, they end up in Cleveland, where he goes to work in metal foundries, and you know, has a good life. You know, these were good-paying, unionized jobs, and Percy, following that great migration, Percy and Josephine found their place. The Kennedy sisters, one of my favorite portraits here. You look at the Kennedy sisters, you can tell they're poor women. They are poor women. You look at the way that they are dressed, you look at their tattered clothes, they are poor. But boy, poverty does not define them at all. I mean, you look at their poise, and you look at their strength, and you look at the way they're addressing this camera. You know, this camera's this big old thing with a huge lens in front of it, and there's a white guy behind it. They're in a photo studio, undoubtedly for the first time in their lives, and yet they have this poise and this sense of self, and they just radiate it. You know, neither poverty nor their employment as housekeepers, none of that tells us about who they are. It tells us how they earned a living. we have just met, the project team, we've just met some descendants of the Kennedy sisters. We haven't interviewed them yet, but we're just so excited. One of the things about doing very, very local projects like this is that the descendants are absolutely around. Well, you look at the Kennedy sisters and you're thinking, maybe the Jim Crow era is not the right term for this time in America's history. Maybe we can find something else. And African Americans did find something else. African Americans were calling this the New Negro era. The New Negro was widely used from about 1900, a little earlier. Here's Booker T. Washington, partially contributed heavily to this book about the new Negro for the new century. And this idea of New Negro-ness was also part and parcel of what was going on all over the country, including in small towns like Charlottesville. I mean, that sense that there is something happening within the African American community that's new. Now, we're really lucky to have this because this manifesto about the New Negro is written by George W. Buckner. Now, he's the father of Eileen, who you saw with her grandfather, A.J. Buckner, earlier. George W. Buckner had been raised in Charlottesville, had gone to Hampton, had spent some time at Tuskegee teaching there, had come back to Charlottesville, and he was infused with these new ideas. And what are these new ideas? He had a way with words, and I have to turn around to read this. The new Negro, the country over, is coming to see that his salvation is in his own hands. Thank God the pussyfooting, Me Too, boss hat in hand Negro is gone. That is why we are termed the new Negroes. This language was being used all over the country. And, you know, in that language, maybe not so forcefully stated, you can see the new Negro-ness of the portraits that I've been showing you. Well, you know, Buckner was a very, very serious man and eventually becomes a civil rights leader in St. Louis. But you can see the kinds of demands that were serious demands. Of course, African American teachers were paid less than white teachers. Of course, African American neighborhoods didn't have paved streets. Of course, there wasn't representation on city council or on the school board, but black people wanted it. You know, at this period, I was telling you that there was no high school for black students, and the demand for a black high school was something that the African American community was pushing. And in the late 1920s, eventually a high school for black students finally came to Charlottesville. So this is the new Negro was a nationwide phenomenon. Elaine Locke was sort of the godfather, was considered himself and was seen to be by a lot of people as the later godfather of the new Negro movement. And what's interesting about Elaine Locke is when he's talking about the new spirit in the African American community, he's using language that is very similar to language that George W. Buckner had used a few years earlier, right? You know, so this was really floating around. The new Negro, it was real. But let us not dismiss the old Negro, right? And Frederick Douglass was somebody who certainly understood all of these issues that I've been talking about and was so adept at demonstrating how photography could be used. He started thinking about photography very early on, as I was saying, when he was quite a young man. And, you know, at this time, he was best known for his work as an abolitionist speaker, as the author of autobiographies that really brought to the reading public the horrors of enslavement, as much as literature can do. But it did horrify audiences, and he published anti-slavery newspaper. That's what he was best known for. But, you know, he's thinking about photography. He's thinking about this incredible new technology and saying there's something going on here. That we have this new technology that can make pictures more abundant, can make them more clearly and better defined, and can make them more inexpensively. It's opening it up to everybody, including the humbled servant girl, who can have a better picture made of herself than all the royalty of Europe ever could up until this point. He was seeing it as something that was really democratizing the representation of the self, right? Before photography, very few of the people whose portraits I've been showing you could have afforded a portrait. You would have had to hire a painter to do it, or a sketch artist. If the sketch artist or the painter was any good, it would be expensive to do. But now you go into the studio. And so Douglass understood that it's democratized and it can become a tool. It can become a weapon. It can become a weapon in the liberation of African Americans. And he was the first, but by no means the last, of people who have been saying things like that. And he was consistent in his use of photography. He wanted to be seen as the representative African American. So you're thinking, well, why did he never smile in a portrait? Well, it's because he wanted to be serious, and he wanted to project his seriousness, and he wanted to project his intelligence. He wanted to project his strength. He wanted to project his tenacity. He wanted to project his perseverance. He wanted to project the fact that we are making demands on this country as citizens of America, and we're not going away. Is remarkably consistent from his time he was a relatively young man to the time that he was an old man. The late Bell Hooks, who passed away about a year ago or so, one of our best writers on cultural issues, also understood photography in much the same way. And this quote about black folks weren't going around calling photography a weapon in the struggle for liberation. It's not the language that most people who weren't activists used, but she understood that African Americans saw it that way and used it that way. So these portraits, these incredibly beautiful portraits, we're using them for a variety of purposes. Sometimes it's just the aesthetics. After the exhibition is over, we're going to give the prints that are on the wall, we're going to give them to schools, because we're going to give them to schools that promise to display them and not put them up in the principal's office, right? Because we want school children to see them. We want black children and white children to see these portraits, because we know that when people imagine what did black folks look like in 1923, they're not imagining this. And we want them to imagine this. We want this to be part of their visual imagination. We don't know very much we've done a lot of research, and we can tell you things about most of the people in the portraits. We can't tell you things about everybody. We can't tell you about these two gentlemen here. But it's a beautiful portrait, and we want it out there because of its aesthetics. Marie Gordon, who's holding, this is wonderful. I keep telling you about the girls and their diplomas, but on this one, it's unraveled. You can actually read it if you get up close, and it is her 8th grade diploma to what was called the Jefferson Graded School, which preceded the black high school in town. And here, Marie and undoubtedly her mother are really making a statement about Marie and her aspirations and her dreams and what should be her future in America. I mean, there's the diploma, there's the flowers, there's this beautiful gown that was undoubtedly made by a local seamstress, a local black seamstress. There are the gloves. It's an incredible ensemble, and it's an incredible statement about who Marie is and who she dreams of being. D.J. Ward, another portrait sitter who was born into slavery, eventually becomes the owner of a clothing store and laundry, very much a member of the black middle class, and also active in civic politics. The Hawkins family, a farming family. They all farmed. So what you're looking at is an extended farming family, but pillars of the local African American community. I can't tell you anything about the women in this portrait. I just love the way they look. You know, our argument that these portraits really mean something depends on a number of different things, and one of the things it depends on is that African Americans were very self-conscious about how they presented themselves to the camera. They were very self-conscious about how they posed and what they dressed, how they dressed. And so I can't tell you anything about Harvey Foster. You know, I'm an historian. I know how to do research. I could not find anything about Harvey Foster. But this image, let me tell you how it's made. All the portraits that you're looking at are on 5x7 glass plate negatives. So they're quite large, 5 inches by 7 inches. You could mask one side of the image, take a portrait, and then mask the other side of the glass plate and make another portrait. So you could do a 2-for-1. There were lots of reasons for doing it. You often saw people trying out different poses, or there'd be two people in one pose and just a single person in the other. But here, Harvey Foster is doing two things. He shows up in his work clothes, and then he shows up in his hipster clothes. Now, the word at the time was sport, so he's a sport. And he's looking pretty spruce. So if you want the slang of the day, he's a sport and he looks spruce in his civilian clothes. But there are many, being an historian, there are many times I've wished I had a time machine and I could go back and actually talk to people. And I would like to say, hey, Harvey, why'd you do this? I mean, it's cool. I love it. It's great. But what can I tell people in 2023 about exactly why you wanted to be seen in your work clothes? The other one I get, but the work clothes, maybe some of you have some ideas, and we'll get to it. Flossie. So Flossie Brooks and Theodore. This is unusual for a couple of different reasons. Flossie paid for the picture. We know that. We have the ledger books. We know who paid for the picture and how much they paid. So Flossie paid for this, and they're smiling, or at least they're smiling in one of the things. And you notice that smiles are very uncommon. You know, for most people, going to the studio was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. And so, you wanted to look serious. You wanted to look sober. You didn't want to look silly or goofy or anything like that. And so to have a smile is really great. They married soon afterwards. Once again, a young African-American couple trying to get on their feet economically in America. It was hard. They went to Baltimore. Theodore worked as a barber, couldn't quite do it. They go to Atlantic City, and it's Atlantic City where Theodore gets a job at the post office, Flossie does something else. But they work and they struggle, and by 1950, right, so we've seen the 1950 census, Flossie no longer has to work out of the house. They own their own house. Theodore's still working for the post office. I mean, they found their little slice of the American dream in Atlantic City. The Reverend John Osborne, yeah. Like I said, I get to know these people and then I forget their names. John Osborne C. He's best known, actually, for a hymn that he wrote, City of Refuge, which still appears in hymnals from time to time. He had a small Baptist church in Albemarle County, but he worked for a living as a janitor at UVA. You would never say he was a janitor at UVA. Well, you can say that he worked for a living, but he was something very, very, very different than that. I'm completely out of time, but I'm going to show you a few more portraits because they're so good. The Reverend C here, of course, wants to emphasize that he's a man of the cloth and he's looking very sober, dressed in black, and he's holding this big, thick book. We've examined the negative, and if you put a loop on it and magnify it very, very large, you can see he's actually holding a dictionary. You know, romance was something that American visual culture just denied to African Americans. You never saw African Americans in love. You know, you just didn't. You didn't see romantic affection between African Americans in mainstream American visual culture at the time. It just wasn't there. Sometimes you got lust, right? You got lust, but you didn't get romance. And, you know, the gesture that this couple is making, you know that the photographer did not tell them to do that, because there's no photographer who could imagine them holding hands in just that way. But they are holding hands in just that way. It's an incredibly beautiful thing. Within this collection, we see the pride of home ownership. We see the pride of service in the military, answering your nation's call, fighting for liberty overseas that you do not enjoy at home. We see also some interesting things about popular culture. So Jesse White is holding some paper there, and some sheets of paper that if you turn it upside down and magnify it, you can tell that one of the sheets of paper that she was holding was Snooky Ookums, sheet music for this Irving Berlin hit. It was a hit. Snooky Ookums was a hit. If you want to listen to it, you can on YouTube, and it was a big hit. And so she's got the sheet music from the very time that it was a nationwide hit, which tells us something about the circulation of popular music, right, and popular culture, and that young people, young African-American people were absolutely tied into it. You know, this is the early days of recorded sound, and most people did not have a gramophone in their home, but they often had a piano. And the ability to play a piano was widespread at the time. I mean, more than we can possibly really imagine it. So I'm certain that Jessie White could play the piano, and she was playing Snooky Ookums. Most people in these portraits are going for a kind of middle-class respectability. I've talked about that, you know. And here, Bland Harris is clearly going for something else. I show this picture, and it's like, oh, he must be a gambler or pool shark or something like that. So, no, he's a farmer. Bland and Nettie had a farm in Nelson County, and they worked that farm in Nelson County until they got too old to work it. You know, and of course their children didn't want to take over the farm. The children went to Richmond and a variety of other places. But yeah, I mean, you're looking at a farming couple. That's what they did for a living, but Bland had other ideas about how he wanted to be seen. African-American businesses, there were a lot in Charlottesville. This is a used clothing store. This is Taylor's home, but he was actually selling insurance for the Southern Aid Company. That was a Richmond-based African-American insurance company. That was the first African-American insurance company in the country. Southern Aid was, so he's an agent for them in Charlottesville. Zion Union Baptist Church, quite a significant structure, and you know it's been torn down. It was torn down during urban renewal in Charlottesville, and Zion Union has a new building now, a nice new building. Well, it was new in the 60s. But that's not the largest Black Baptist church in Charlottesville, right? So it gives you a sense of what the Black community was part of. You know, we've spent so much time thinking about the negative side, the dark side of history, and you do have to talk about the dark side of history. We have to know about segregation, Jim Crow, lynchings. We have to understand scientific racism. We have to understand other things too. We have to understand a community that's capable of building churches like this and churches that are even bigger. We have to understand what is it that powers a man like Bill Hurley here. Once again, you're looking at somebody who was born a slave, born into slavery. He's made himself into something else. Now, as working for a living, I mean, he was a jack of all trades. He was a horseman. He was a stable hand. He never had a whole lot of money, but he certainly had a sense of himself. And one of the things that we're really interested in is the way that there are glimpses here of the way that African Americans were creating their own autonomous cultural identities, right? An autonomous African American culture. And Susie Smith, who earned her living as a housemaid, you know, she wasn't going to listen to anybody who said, Miss Smith, would you please sit up and face the camera? No, no, no. She's got something else going on. Because this was also the jazz age, right? This is a moment when African Americans are engaged in creating that autonomous African American culture that expresses things and is something that is not about white middle class values and virtues. Mamie Smith is here because she was very popular in Charlottesville. We have a newspaper account of her sold out to African Americans concert. So she was really popular, and to you know, connect somebody like Mamie Smith to Golden Coles, and Golden Coles about 19 here, and you can see, you know, that the clothes that he's wearing are on their way to being a zoot suit. They're just not quite there. You know, and it's that hipsterness. It is that sense that we are creating also a culture that's not about emulating middle-class white values or style or anything else. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't mean he's a rebel. You know, at the time he was working as a janitor at the University of Virginia, but you know, he lived long enough that things started to open up in the 1950s and into the 1960s, and he eventually becomes a lab technician at the university hospital. So, you know, this is one side of him as a teenager. The other side of him is becoming a lab technician in the hospital. And I started here with Minnie McDaniel, and I started with Minnie McDaniel because this is such a spectacularly beautiful portrait of a very, very beautiful woman. You know, she had a hard life. She had a really hard life. Married a couple of times, moved around a lot, worked as a laundress, worked as a housekeeper, worked as a cook. But in this image here, boy, you know, this is aspiration, this is dreams, but this is also in a sense of who she really was. I'm convinced that that dress was, well, the dress was clearly made for her. Probably made by, once again, a local African-American seamstress. Within the project, we have a debate about whether it's red or blue. It's one of those two primary colors. We just don't know which one it is. I can see it both ways. I kind of hope it's blue, though. But you know, these images are images of African Americans just sort of claiming this power that photography gives us to represent ourselves. So I'm not going to stop there, though. I'm going to stop here. And so I, like a lot of you, I've seen the Sir Isaac Julien installation, and like many of you, you're just emotionally drained when you walk out, and you need some quiet time, right? And the first thing I saw when I walked out of the exhibition is this beautiful sculpture by a South African artist, Dumile Fenny, and I was thinking, wow, you know, the representation is not just about cameras, right? And it's also complex. That, you know, Frederick Douglass had this line in there where he says, you know, the thing I like about the camera is that it takes the subjectivity out of portrait making, and he didn't trust white artists not to exaggerate African features. Well, here you have exaggerated African features in this incredibly dignified, I mean, both beautiful and dignified portrait that is a bust. And, you know, it really moved me, and it moved me especially because I spent the first part of my career thinking about South Africa, writing about South Africa, being in South Africa, researching South Africa, and understanding how South Africa and the United States have so much in common. And one of the things, of course, they have in common are elaborate systems of white supremacy that have to do with the denigration of African Americans and the the denigration of oppressed people, Africans in South Africa, African Americans here, and the way that visual representation was so important in that denigration, but also that visual representation has been so important in overcoming that, in fighting against it, and challenging it and contradicting it. And it can be done in a variety of different ways. You know, I just love the portraits that I've been showing you, but I also love this bust because it takes it in a different direction. But the strength, the beauty, the dignity of this portrait, it was something that I needed after seeing the Isaac Julien show, sort of an affirmation, a connection with another part of the world, another part of my life. So, thank you very much.